But maybe just staying on the 90s, there are going to be a lot of indie game developers who listen to us talking today. Can you go back to that mindset and try to derive some wisdom and advice to those folks when you were just a solo developer, maybe just a small group of people uh, creating your early games that eventually became this uh, huge gaming company? But in the early days, what were you going through? What were the ups and downs? What did it take to sort of stay strong and persevere?
Well, one of the critical things that Epic always worked hard to do was to make something different that nobody else was doing, and to try to satisfy a small audience rather than competing globally with the game juggernauts. Back in the 1990s, Epic was new, but Electronic Arts and Activision and the other big publishers had been around for a decade, and they were huge companies that had giant retail distribution networks. If I tried to make a game and then convince them to publish it, I doubt I could have had a chance, and I doubt that if even if I made a successful game, that I would have made much money from it, though they might have. And so the really unique angle to Epic then was shareware, and that was just the idea that if we distribute our game differently, then we can reach a much larger audience than these bigger competitors by virtue of this first episode of the game being free. It was kind of the advent of what later became free to play, and the logic of that is just as true now as it was then. It's if the thing is free and anybody can get into it, then it's going to spread from friend to friend as
Hmm.
people bring their real world friends into the games they're playing, and have the opportunity to build up a community around that. So the other lesson there was just minimize the friction of people getting into your game, make it easy to get into, and make it fun. And I think the other, well, I was very fortunate. ZZT was a funny game. It was not like much like any other game. It had much worse graphics because it was all just text characters, smiley faces, and other Greek letters and things participating in this game simulation. They were kind of iconic representations of characters rather than real ones. And this was decades into the age of real graphical games with interesting graphics. And so it wasn't even trying to compete in that area, but it was able to compete in a different area, which is that, it wasn't just the three games that I'd made and shipped as a trilogy that were successful and drove the success of the product. It was the fact that I released an editor and there's a whole community around it. And you see that trend has repeated itself. Like there was ZZT was one of it. Before that, there was Bill Budge's Pinball Construction Set. That was a 1980s Apple game that let users build their own pinball tables. And since then, you've had some of the world's most successful games follow that path, like Minecraft. You can build your own stuff. Roblox, now Fortnite Creative and Unreal Editor for Fortnite. Games that become platforms for other people to build stuff was a real opportunity. I think the big thing to realize is for indie developers right now is like there's massive, massive competition in every major genre, and so it's very unlikely that unless you just happen to be the world's best at a particular thing, that you're going to release a game in an existing highly competitive genre and win. A much better chance of success is in releasing something that hasn't been done before, being really unique and reaching an audience, even if big or medium size or small, reaching an audience and becoming really popular with that, making some money from it and being able to reinvest and then expand towards your ultimate dream. I think the one shot go from idea to commercial success at massive scale is a lot less likely than the multi-step process of continually build better and better stuff over time until you get into a position of excellence.
And constantly try to do something that others aren't doing.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you look at every market, there's a few markets where the current leader came late to the space, usually because the prior leader failed so horribly. But most of the time, the company that's succeeding and winning in a market is the first or second entrant there. They've just continually buoyed their success.
Great advice and fascinating. But on a human level, was it lonely? Was it scary? You sitting there as a developer?
I'd say it was the opposite of lonely because you know the thing that spurred me to actually release this was seeing kids playing the game in my neighborhood and having fun and being like, this is really good. And seeing them enjoying it and laughing and pointing at the screen and, getting together and just wanting to play more.
That's awesome.
Um, yeah, and the human element was always pervasive, because I could not only receive orders, but people would actually write letters. We wrote letters back then in the 1990s. People would say how much they were enjoying the game and how their kids were playing the game and so on and so on. So, it felt very connected. And, I think a lot of businesses have to make scary decisions, because you're spending, potentially all of the money you have to take a shot at something that you're not sure will succeed. Uh, I was very fortunate starting a business like this because it didn't really need any capital. The capital was, well, the several $1,000s in computers I'd bought by mowing lawns. Um, and, it wasn't much risk. If that hadn't succeeded, I guess I could have figured out how people get mechanical engineering jobs and pursued that. But, once it took off and once the orders started coming in and people started writing letters saying they're enjoying the game, I knew I was gonna go all out and try to build a company there and succeed, and that was, like, gonna be, my big goal.